Thank you. So in the first part of this paper, I will give a general overview of Neo-impressionism. That's what Jérôme asked me to do. And in the second part, I will focus on the issue of the touch, according to Signac's writings. Neo-impressionism is an artistic movement that started as a section of the 8th and last Impressionist exhibition in 1886. Its founding figure was Georges Seurat, whose monumental painting, Sunday Afternoon, on the island of the Grand Jatte, is a kind of standard bearer of the whole movement. Seurat died in 1891 at his early 30s. His death corresponds more or less to the end of Neo-impressionism's first life, all the more since Camille Pissarro gave up the new technique around the same time. After Seurat's death, Paul Signac became the leader of the movement and his chief publicist. The main features of Neo-impressionism are a faith in science and color science, the use of bright colors, and of a special technique, optical mixture, aimed at giving more luminosity to colors. The term Neo-impressionism was coined by the critic Félix Fénéon, one of the best spokesmen of the movement. The Neo-impressionist artists didn't want indeed to break with Impressionism, and one of the main Impressionist painters, Camille Pissarro, was himself part of the Neo-impressionist movement. So they just wanted to continue it in a more rigorous and scientific way. However, one of the differences between the two movements is that, unlike the Impressionists, the Neo-impressionists wanted to render permanent features of their facture, and not ever-changing moments. Since the superficial features of their facture is the use of small dots of colors, the term of pointillisme, I will come back to it, is often used in order to describe their technique. The main scientific sources of Neo-impressionist color practice are first Michel-Eugène Chevreul, a French chemist who worked at the Gobelin manufacturers. The Neo-impressionists knew his theory through an art historian called Charles Leblanc. And the other source is Roode, an American physicist. Now, these sources are contradictory, at least concerning color harmony. As Chevreul, so Chevreul seen through Blanc, used pairs of complementary colors popularized through Blanc, so in this color star, and Roode used a new pair of complementary colors based on Helmholtz researches. And as you can see, that it's not exactly the same. For example, for Chevreul, yellow and violet are complementary colors, while for Roode, yellow and ultramarine blue. So it's not exactly the same. And this explains Seurat's hesitation between the two color systems. Since the Impressionist painters used scientific sources and were very interested in what science could bring them, they visited Chevreul on one occasion and his assistant on another in order to understand better what they call the division of light. Now, what about Chevreul's law, and why has it been so important for these painters? Basically, the law of simultaneous contrast reads, in the case where the eye sees at the same time two contiguous colors, they will appear as dissimilar as possible, both in their optical composition and in the height of their tone. What does this mean? That the brain has a tendency to exaggerate differences in order to better perceive them. Above all, along the borders where two different hues are juxtaposed. This law which is still valid today, works, as Chevreul rightly claimed, for lightness as well as for hues. In the case of lightness, it means that there is a contrast of what Chevreul called tone. I prefer to use contrast of lightness, illustrated in this plate. If we juxtapose two samples of gray, one lighter and another one darker, the lighter is perceived even lighter and the darker even darker, above all around the borderline. This contrast is cleverly made more obvious when we compare the two samples of the same tone, because this one and this one are exactly the same, and this one too. But so we can see the difference when one is seen in isolation and the other next to another with a different degree of lightness. This first contrast is a point of departure of Seurat's first drawings. Now, in the case of hues, the exaggerations of difference means, according to Chevreul, that the brain tends to add to a perceived hue part of the complementary color of the juxtaposed hue. Concretely, explains Chevreul, if we look at a gray pattern of a color on a colored ground, we will perceive this gray pattern slightly tinted with a hue complementary to that of the ground. It's not very obvious to see it because of the size, but well, it works more or less. So on the blue ground, they will look slightly orange. On an orange, bluish. On a yellow one, it will appear slightly violet. Conversely, on a violet ground, it looks yellowish. And finally, on a red ground, it will appear greenish, and on a green one, reddish. To make it visually more effective, Chevreul published a plate that made a deep impression on painters, showing how on a white ground, when we stare at small discs of pure colors, we perceive a fringe effect as a halo of the complementary color all around the disc. These discs, in which Chevreul consciously exaggerated the effect produced since the ground around the disc was tinted, had an unexpected consequence insofar as they gave artists the impression that they had to do the same, that is, tint the background around a color with its complementary color, when Chevreul explained that he was exaggerating the effect in order to make it more visible. But this is exactly what Neo-impressionist painters did. Another important point must be mentioned: what happens when the two contiguous colors are complementary colors. So, for example, if we look at this, so the three are complementary colors. But so if we look at the green and the red, what happens? According to the law of simultaneous color, the green one will be tinted by the complementary hue of the contiguous color. Now the complementary color of red is green. As a consequence, the green zone will be perceived as greener, and conversely, the red one will be perceived as redder. Hence, the importance of the law of simultaneous contrast for color harmony. As so many painters were trying to enhance their colors, this law provided them with an extraordinary device, and this is one of the main reasons for Chevreul's success, not only on painters, but also on graphic design, on houses decoration, on gardening, and so on. Now, different origin of the so-called pointillism can be traced from the sources given by the artists. The first is Charles Leblanc, who coined the expression optical mixture, a technique already used by Delacroix, according to him, as well as by the Impressionists. The basic idea is to mix colors not on the palette, but juxtapose them on the canvas so that when seen at a distance, they fuse into the eye and produce a new color not present as such on the canvas. In order to make this suggestion more concrete, Blanc added a drawing with little dots on the left-hand side and some stars on the right-hand side. Roode gave a more complete description of optical mixture in his book published in 1879 and translated into French in 1881. He first described a method given by Maille in 1839 in order to mix colors in the eye from small contiguous dots of colors, and Roode also quoted John Ruskin, who recommended a similar method. It must be noted that Monet, as well as Signac, praised a lot Ruskin's book, The Elements of Drawing. Roode himself gave Painter the same advice. I'm quoting Roode. There is, however, he said, another lower degree of gradation, which has a peculiar charms of its own, and it's very precious in art and nature. The effect referred to take place when different colors are placed side by side in lines or dots, and when viewed at such a distance that the blending is more or less accomplished by the eye of the beholder. Under these circumstances, the tints mix on the retina and produce new colors, which are identical with those which are obtained by the methods of revolving discs. The end of this quote explains why neo-impressionists, painters, were so interested by this method suggested by Roode. Indeed, Roode made a fascinating experiment in order to compare the luminosity of color mixed on the palette with the optical mixtures of the same hues. For this purpose, he used two rotating discs. The larger disc was divided into two equal halves painted with vermilion in the upper part and ultramarine blue in the lower part. Now, an equal number of drops of the same washes of watercolor pigments were mixed on the palette in order to paint the small disc that you can see in the center. After rotating the two discs, Roode realized that the smaller disc looked gray and dull, while the larger one looked brighter. So, in order to obtain a similar result on both discs, he had to add black to the larger one. And so you can see here the result of Roode's experiment. It is really surprising that Roode had to add up to 52% of black to the larger disc in order to match the mixture made on the palette. Many artists were struck by this experiment, and Fénéon gave it as an example in order to explain the new technique and its superiority in terms of luminosity. Quoting the results of Roode's experiment, Fénéon stressed that, I quote, "The luminosity of optical mixture is always superior to that of material mixture," and justified accordingly the new neo-impressionist technique. So this technique is then rather complex and cannot be limited to pointillisme. And Signac insisted a lot on the fact that the dots are just a means and cannot be considered as a characteristic of neo-impressionism. He was very upset because critics and painters as well reduced the new technique to the dot, which is only part of a whole. For him, using dots is not enough. Much more important for its technique is a divided touch. Using mere dots is not sufficient if the technique of color contrast is not used. So it is important to give this precision. So now in the second part of this paper, I would like to focus on the issue of the touch. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to quote a lot Signac, so it will be rather boring, but it seems to me important in order to understand better all this issue. Before starting, it must be said that his book, From Eugène Delacroix to Neo-impressionism, written in the late 1890s, has been conceived as a defense of the movement. So the rhetorical strategy adopted by Signac, and which is clearly expressed in the title, From Eugène Delacroix to Neo-impressionism, was to show that the movement, which was still criticized at the time, was not so new and could be understood as developing ideas already present in Delacroix as well as in Impressionism. So what is touch? Signac writes, the means of expression, the optical mixture of small colored touches, methodically put one next to the other, hardly allows skill or virtuosity. The hand will have little importance. Only the painter's brain and eye will have a part to play. After writing that, Signac added that the new Impressionist painters refused to be tempted by the charm of the brushstroke. And so here he uses in French coup de pinceau, which can be translated by brushstroke, and use not a bright facture, but a meticulous and precise one. In doing so, the Impressionists took into account what Delacroix said. And then comes a quote from Delacroix, which reads, "The great matter is to avoid this infernal convenience of the brush. The young men are crazy about the hand skill. This universal obsession," says Delacroix, "is maybe the most important obstacle to any real progress." After quoting Delacroix and his strong critique against the hand skill, Signac uses Delacroix again, this time in order to legitimize the neo-impressionist touch. And indeed, Delacroix praised it a lot. So the first quote from Delacroix on this topic is, I'm quoting, "All the arts have their adopted and accepted means of execution, and one is only an incompleted connoisseur if one cannot read these indications of thought. The evidence for that is that the layman prefers the smoothest and the least touched paintings and prefers them for this reason." It might be strange, at least at first sight, to realize that Delacroix and Signac, after him, at the same time condemn brushstroke and praise the touch. One might logically wonder if it is not contradictory. So in order to understand this apparent contradiction, it is important to make a distinction between two factors, a distinction made by themselves, and which have different names. One is touch, the other brushstroke. In French as well as in English, a touch is literally the fact of touching the surface of the canvas with a paintbrush. Interestingly, Delacroix also used touch not as a substantive but as an adjective when he talks in a sentence I just quoted about the least touched paintings. The touch, therefore, is a minimal intervention, the fact of touching the canvas with the brush at the moment of painting. The brushstroke, instead, requires a movement of the hand. A gesture. That's the reason why it is frequently associated with the hand. In French, the word coup also contains exactly the same image as in English, a movement, but also a gesture and the fact of striking. However, brushstroke doesn't mean using physical strength. So this is a difference with the two primes we saw. Brushstroke is not the use of strength with a brush, but a larger movement, just like what you can see here. So now, why does Delacroix condemn the brushstroke and praise the touch, as does Signac too? For Delacroix, the brushstroke is a very subjective gesture, a movement of the hand which remains independent of the painting and its subject matter. He sees it as a mere skill producing easy effects, while style for him would require a long research process. But why does he praise the touch? The main reason is that for Delacroix, the touch, unlike brushstroke, is related to the painting subject matter. Indeed, he conceived of the touch as part of the painting and contributing to its meaning. In another passage quoted by Signac, Delacroix wrote, "The touch is a means, among others, to render the thought," I'm underlining, "in a painting. Color is another means to produce the same effect." So an analogy could be made between color and touch. As about color, in another sentence quoted also by Signac, Delacroix said, "Color is nothing if it is not convenient to the subject matter." Delacroix relies here on a way of understanding colors known as mode theory, already illustrated by Poussin, and according to which the choice of color must fit the kind of painting being painted. For example, for a sad subject, dark color must be used, while in a cheerful subject, saturated and bright colors are recommended. Delacroix is not so clear, unfortunately, about the part played by touch. However, as quoted above, he said that the touch is part of the thought, that means the meaning of the painting. So, insofar as the touch for him plays a part in the thought of the work, that is, in its meaning, it is perfectly justified, and even more than justified, it is necessary. From this point of view, Delacroix is quite opposed to Ingres, who claimed that, I'm quoting Ingres, "What is called touch is an abuse of execution. It is only the quality of false talented person, of false artists, who wander from the imitation of nature in order to merely show their skill. Touch, even though it is very skilled, must not be apparent. Otherwise, it prevents illusion and locks everything. Instead of the represented object, it makes the way of doing, procédé in French, visible. Instead of thought, it denounces the hand." So that's the position of Ingres, very radical. Part of the argument given by Delacroix in order to defend the touch seems to be directed against Ingres. On the one hand, Delacroix claims that touch serves to render the thought of a painting, while Ingres considers the other way around, that touch is completely opposed to the thought of a painting, that is, its meaning. On the other hand, the relation to nature is also completely opposed. For Ingres, indeed, the fact of making touch visible is contrary to the aim of painting, that is faithfulness to nature. So, for Ingres and about the relationship to nature, for Delacroix, I quote him again, "A painting must be very beautiful without showing the touch. But it is childish to think that doing that one would be closer to nature." So it seems to me important. And interestingly, Signac completely shares Delacroix's ideas about this point. Later in his book, he replies to objections against the Neo-impressionist technique explaining that unlike Delacroix and Impressionists, the divided touch is not yet admitted. And so Signac writes, for example, it is said that nature doesn't look like that. We don't have multicolored spots on the face. That's why. And so Signac replies, Delacroix's hatching, the Impressionist commerce, Neo-impressionist divided touch are artificial tools used by these painters in order to express their particular vision of nature. As a simple colored element, it can be used for all subject matter due to its own impersonality. And so this is important too. This is important because it should be clear now, at least I do hope so, that Signac, following Delacroix, criticizes brushstrokes and at the same time praises touch. There is, however, an important difference between Signac and Delacroix. When Signac says that the divided touch is impersonal, he doesn't refer to the process of painting, that is, to an impersonal execution, but to the relationship between touch and the painting subject. As Signac pointed out, touch is impersonal because it is not adapted to the painting topic. If in the first part of his book focused on the similarity between Neo-impressionism and Delacroix, Signac insists, of course, a lot on what they share, what they have in common. In the last part, however, he emphasizes the differences. When coming back to the issue of touch, Signac sees an evolution from Delacroix to the Impressionist, I don't know if, and finally to the Neo-impressionist. Their touches are given a name. For Delacroix, it is the hatching. For the Impressionist, the comma, because it has the same shape. And for the Neo-impressionist, the divided touch. Note that Signac never uses the word dot. About Delacroix, Signac stresses that the hatching is bound to the painting thought. He considers it as a romantic technique well adapted to Delacroix's will to emphasize movement. For Signac, Delacroix's hatching are spirited or dashing, that is, romantic. The Impressionist touch, however, is more fragmented. According to Signac, it is well adapted to the aesthetic based on sudden and momentary sensations. Signac also considers that the Impressionist touch constitutes an intermediary step between Delacroix and them. I quote, in some cases, the comma-like Impressionist touch has the same expressive role as Delacroix's hatching. For instance, when it imitates the shape of an object, leaf, wave, blade of grass, but in other cases, just like the Neo-impressionist divided touch, it just represents separated and juxtaposed colored elements that can be reconstituted by an optical mixture. So Signac insists on this feature that is specific to the Neo-impressionist painters since, I quote him again, they don't give any importance to the shape of the touch. For they are not in charge of molding, expressing a feeling, or imitating the shape of an object. For them, a touch is just one of the many colored elements whose importance is merely that of a note in a symphony. So the reason given is that for him, expression of feelings of agreeable or sad subject are given not by the dot, but by the lines. So following the theories of Charles-Henri. For these reasons, Signac says that this simple and precise way of expression, the divided touch, is related to the clear and methodic aesthetic of the painters who use it. So, for Signac, The three factors, hatching, comma, and divided touch, have a common aim: to get colors as bright as possible thanks to the optical mixture of juxtaposed pigments. Signac considers that the three factors are, I quote him again, three identical conventional means, but adapted to the particular requirements of their respective aesthetic. The difference, then, is not about the ends, but about the means and what Signac calls the aesthetic principle corresponding to the technique. Now, the specificity of neo-impressionist technique has been well emphasized by an art historian, a very important one, Meyer Shapiro, for whom I quote, "The revolutionary character of Seurat is that he has been the first painter in the history to have created paintings whose matter is quite homogeneous. In his work, the small dots that give the color are the same as those that give lines and spaces." This homogeneity has several meanings equally important. Indeed, for an academic painter, there is a correspondence between the touch and what is painted. However, with the dots and their homogeneous construction of the surface, the touch becomes independent of the object, since the same touch is used for the skin and the hair, you can see it, for the trunk of a tree and its leaves. In linguistic terms, we could say that before Neo-impressionism, the touch was motivated, and now it becomes arbitrary. Yet, even if Signac doesn't speak of science, he was quite aware of the arbitrary nature of the dot, since he constantly uses the term conventional to refer to the divided touch and puts emphasis on the fact that it is an artificial means. Now, the fact of using artificial means has a double implication. First, within a painting, the touch as a means becomes independent of the contents of the painting as an end. It is the first step for the means to become an end in themselves. And second, the relationship of painting to nature is also modified. Indeed, using artificial means signifies that the aim of the painting is not being faithful to nature anymore, since the means used to render it don't belong to nature and are conventional. As Signac noted in 1889 in his personal diary, and I like this quote, "Some years ago I tried to prove to the other painters using scientific experiments that these blues, these yellows, and these greens can be found in nature. Now I content myself with saying, I'm painting so because it is a technique that seems to be the most appropriate to give the most harmonious result, the most luminous, the most colored, and because I like it so." So through this quote, we can grasp the dramatic shift occurring in the relationship of painting to nature. Up to the Impressionist, colors were considered as a normal way of representing nature. We look at the colors in nature and try to represent them in a painting. Now, the technique is used not to represent colors in nature, but as Signac emphasized, in order to give a result more harmonious, luminous, and colored as possible. Furthermore, the colors taken as model are not the colors of nature, but the spectral colors, that is, the colors of the rainbow, and they are used pure. This explains that most of the painters that counted for the development of color in the first half of the 20th century passed through an Impressionist period. The list is quite impressive: Matisse, Mondrian, Kandinsky, Malevich, Braque, Delaunay, Kupka, and so on. They were fascinated by the new technique, since the fact of using artificial means has another consequence. The touch as a means becomes independent of the representation of nature, which was the traditional aim of painting. Finally, not only is the divided touch a technique in order to paint to paint through color only, but it also contains a syntax, that is, a way of organizing the contiguous color dots as well as a complex harmony system. So the vocabulary, the dots, the syntax, the divided touch, as well as the harmony constitute a totality in itself, independently of the world of the object paintings was supposed to represent. This is the main reason why the next generation of painters was so interested in Neo-impressionists, read avidly Signac's book, and had a Neo-impressionist phase. The dots were a way of exploring the possibility of painting through colors only, which eventually led to abstract painting. So now, the conclusion, a first remark about vocabulary. Signac uses a lot the term facture in order to refer to the way a painting is technically made. However, this word is not very satisfying, even though it is useful as a general term to refer to touch, brushstroke, hatching, dividing touch, commas, and so on. The problem with this concept is that it belongs to the vocabulary of the connoisseur. In English, it has been used since at least the 15th century. In other words, it corresponds to an aesthetics of the brushstrokes criticized by Delacroix, Ingres, and Signac. From this point of view, they all agree, as a sign of the virtuosity of the hand. As such, it emphasizes the process and brackets out the product. Now, if we speak instead of the texture, it is in order to focus on the feature of the surface, but in so doing, we don't take the process into account. So how to take into account both process and result in terms of enunciation theory? In French, we would say l'énonciation et l'énoncé, so utterance and statement. That's the reason why I prefer to use the Russian concept Faktura, which was coined by the Russian formalists in the early 20s. Faktura with a K, as it embraces both process and result of the process. Doing so, I follow a suggestion given a special issue of the journal EHESS, precisely devoted to Faktura. So now, conclusion. I would like first to say that it might be useful to try to understand the issue of the touch from a semiotic perspective, if we agree to see in it a sign. In art history, two main reasons, have been given in order to condemn touch. The first one is that the sign must be transparent. It must hide itself in order to better show the represented objects. If you want a painting to give the impression of a third dimension, its surface must be as transparent as glass. That's why Ingres, that's exactly what Ingres said. And for this purpose, the touch cannot be visible. And so the second one is that brushstrokes are special signs that refers to the maker of the work. Their meaning is the virtuosity of the hand, hence their rejection by Delacroix and Signac, who consider that they divert the attention from the paintings to the painter's hand. Now, what about the divided touch of the Neo-impressionists? What kind of signs are there? Regarding Peirce's famous classification of signs, then can be considered as simultaneously index, icons, and symbols. Index, since there are marks of the brush and therefore marks of a movement, of a gesture. Icons, since they constitute, thanks to their colors, they contribute, to the recognition of the painted scene. And finally, symbols, as they are conventional signs, equally applied to all the parts of the painting and independently of the represented objects. This means that they simultaneously require a triple kind of attention. Attention and you can see it from this detail of Seurat, attention to the represented scene here, the face, through the touch, attention to the touch itself as an autonomous organization of luminous and vibrant color dots, and finally, attention to the dots as marks on the canvas, marks that refer to Facture. I'm conscious of the fact that what I say is a rough sketch. What happens is that we still lack tools in art history in order to analyze touch that has generally been overlooked by art historians. Interestingly, psychoanalysts have nevertheless drawn our attention to touch's emotional meaning. Writing about painting, Ehrenzweig observed that, I quote, "The great emotional power of spontaneous handwriting," so he used the word handwriting for painting, "testifies to its hidden meaning and symbolism." And Ehrenzweig added, "A great work of painting stripped of its original brushwork by a bad restorer will lose almost all of its substance." And Lacan also noted, I quote, "Don't forget that the painter's touch is something where a movement ends." He therefore insists on the fact that the gesture is always present when we look at the painting, gesture as a driving force to which refers the touch. Thank you.